Hi, and welcome to Really Understanding Incoterms 2020, a series of comprehensive masterclasses. This is lesson 16, the second of two on FOB, free on board, named port of shipment. But first, the necessary disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. The contents of this course are not legal advice. I was a member of the International Chamber of Commerce's Incoterms 2020 drafting group, which created these rules. Some of the contents of this lesson are direct quotes from the Incoterms 2020 publication number 723E of the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC. My explanations, my comments and my opinions are based on my knowledge and my experience of over 5 decades. My intent in creating this comprehensive course on Incoterms 2020 is to ensure that my knowledge and my experience is passed on to you for a better future in trade. In this lesson, we'll continue looking at FOB, A10, B10 notices, A6, B6 delivery transport document, and A9, B9 allocation of costs. And we'll also look at bills of lading and letters of credit. As always, I'll explain what the book says first, which is where the other trainers and YouTube videos usually stop, but then I'll examine the issues arising from these articles as we go along. A10, B10 notices. A10, the seller must give the buyer sufficient notice, either that the goods have been delivered in accordance with A2, or that the vessel has failed to take the goods within the time agreed. B10, the buyer must give the seller sufficient notice of any transport-related security requirements, the vessel name, the loading point, and, if any, the selected delivery date within the agreed period. What is the form of any such notice? Well, these days, typically all written communications are by email. What is sufficient notice? Again, this is legal rather than practical. This article is devoid of detail, as it's more of a legal requirement than a practical logistics requirement or guidance. Depending on the charter party, which in an FOB transaction the seller would not usually see, there will be notices of readiness, NORs, etc. After all, it's very likely that the buyer chartered the vessel and has appointed its agent at the load port, who will be in regular and constant contact with both the buyer and the seller. A6, delivery transport document. The seller must provide the buyer, at the seller's cost, with the usual proof that the goods have been delivered in accordance with A2. Unless such proof is a transport document, the seller must provide assistance to the buyer at the buyer's request, risk and cost in obtaining a transport document. So what is the usual proof for delivery on board a vessel? Well, that will depend on what is customary at the port, the nature of the goods and even the type of vessel, but is typically a mate's receipt. Now, this will depend on many variables, including what is agreed in the sales contract. And of course, the question is, how or why would a seller obtain a transport document when it has nothing to do with that transport? More on this later. B6, delivery transport document. The buyer must accept the proof of delivery provided under A6. That's all, and it will be as per the sales contract. A9, allocation of costs. The seller must pay A, all costs relating to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2, that's on board, other than those payable by the buyer under B9, which we'll come to. The seller must pay B, the costs of providing the usual proof to the buyer under A6 that the goods have been delivered. The seller must pay C, where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs related to export clearance under A7A, and the seller must pay D, the buyer, for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information in accordance with B7A. B9, allocation of costs. The buyer must pay A, all costs relating to the goods from the time they have been delivered under A2, on board, other than those payable by the seller under A9. The buyer must pay B, the seller, for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information in accordance with A4, 5, 6 and 7B. The buyer must pay C, where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs relating to transit or import clearance under B7B, and D, any additional costs incurred either because 1, the buyer has failed to give notice under B10, or 2, the vessel nominated by the buyer under B10 fails to arrive on time, fails to take the goods, or closes for cargo earlier than the time notified in accordance with B10, provided that the goods have been clearly identified as the contract goods. FOB and bills of lading. Generally speaking, a bill of lading has 3 main purposes. 1, a receipt for the goods issued by the vessel's master to the seller. 2, evidence of a contract of carriage between the charterer and the vessel's owner. And 3, a document to facilitate transfer of title to the goods. In an FOB transaction, the vessel is usually chartered by the buyer, but in a string sale, the buyer in the first transaction is on selling to another buyer which chartered the vessel. The seller is not involved in the contract of carriage. The charter party will not be named in it, usually will not even be given a copy of it, and will not know the terms and conditions in it. Finding a useful definition of shipper, I found, is problematic. The Hague-Visby rules, and thus Carriage of Goods by Sea Act, COGSA, only state carrier includes the owner or the charterer who enters into a contract of carriage with the shipper. There's no definition of shipper in these rules or act. In an FOB transaction, the buyer enters into the contract of carriage. Is the buyer not the seller, then the shipper? If the buyer is the shipper, then it should be named as such on the bill of lading. Charter parties, quite logically, do not require presentation of a bill of lading to obtain the goods at the port of discharge. They are about the contract of carriage, not handing over goods at the destination port. It's the bill of lading itself which typically includes a condition such as, in witness whereof, master or agent of the said vessel, has signed the number of bills of lading indicated below, all of this tenor and date, any one of which being accomplished, the others shall be void. Some charter parties include a statement such as, freight shall be fully paid on release of signed bills of lading, marked freight payable as per charter party. Could this delay the issue of the bill of lading until the buyer pays the freight? The seller really should get good legal advice regarding liabilities as shipper on the bill of lading under a charter party it has not seen. FOB and letters of credit. How does an LC function with an FOB transaction? Not well. An LC is no protection of payment to the seller, as it has already loaded its goods into a ship chartered by the buyer, or maybe even another party unknown to it. If the LC issuing bank claims a discrepancy in the documents presented under the LC, the seller is powerless to control the goods. Legal disputes to recover payment could take years, and even if successful, by that time the buyer might not still exist. LCs almost invariably specify a port of loading, port of discharge, latest date of shipment, and require presentation of an on-board bill of lading. Well, I suggest an LC for an FOB transaction should instead require presentation of a copy of the mate's receipt signed by or on behalf of the vessel's master or owner to be dated no later than X date instead of the bill of lading. Field 44C, latest date of shipment, should not appear in the LC because a transport document, the bill of lading, will not be presented. FOB and LCs do not go together easily, yet are quite common. But remember the buyer's obligation in B1, which is simply to pay the price of the goods. Next lesson, we'll look at CFR and CIF. We'll start with A2, B2, delivery, taking delivery, then A10, B10, notices, A6, B6, delivery and transport document, and A9, B9, allocation of costs, and then A5, B5, insurance for CIF. Again, we'll look at letters of credit. And as always, I will explain what the book says first, which is where other trainers and YouTube videos usually stop if they even go that far. But then I will examine the issues arising for these articles as we go along. If you like this lesson, please click on the thumbs up button below. If you'd like to be alerted to each new lesson, please hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get notices. And please feel free to leave any comments and questions relevant to this lesson below. Till next lesson.